I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Jeffrey Dunne, Chairman of the Board of Trustees at the International Consciousness Research Lab. Jeffrey is the chief scientist at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, where he directs research in information sciences. He holds a PhD in physics from Purdue University and a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Widener University, and serves on the editorial boards of multiple journals, consults as a subject matter expert on open architecture and data strategy, and teaches classes in signal processing and the development of data analytics. As the chairman of ICRL, he works to preserve and extend the legacy of consciousness research started decades ago at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Lab. So Jeffrey, welcome, sir. Let me get started with your background. You're an engineer and a physicist. So let me start out by asking, what inspired you to get involved with consciousness research? And how have you seen this field evolve over time?
Over time, yeah. Well, so interestingly, my involvement with it predates any of my involvement with traditional sciences. I actually got involved in consciousness research at some level, you could say, when I was fairly small, in middle school age, which was when my mother had moved to New Jersey to work with Dr. Robert John, starting up the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory. So this is the place that I used to go after school. And, you know, admittedly, I was probably going there to steal cookies more than I was to engage in consciousness research, but it really was sort of my background in growing up there. And I went into engineering and physics sort of afterwards. My natural inclination tends to be more of the holistic kind of mindset and problem solving structures. And I went into the sciences kind of to augment that, to get into that. So in terms of, you know, how have I seen the field evolve over the years, though, that's kind of the exciting part, I think. And that is because when all of this started, when I became involved, at least I should say, and started to pay attention even at any level, which was would have been in the 80s, essentially, you could say, you know, this is a very taboo subject. It was very difficult to have a conversation with somebody just openly. And what I've noticed over the years is that the world has started to evolve past that. We've started to recognize some of the things that we feel intuitively, which is essentially that we're more than mechanistic biomachines, right? That there's something more to us. And it's increasingly easy to have those conversations with people, and that it's starting to manifest itself back even into the sciences, where I think if you looked 40 years ago, you know, the ideas that were being presented in quantum mechanics were taken as more like, well, it's because we don't really know, but, you know, I'm sure it's all deterministic when you get right down to it. We just haven't figured it out. Whereas today, people are recognizing, you know, consciousness plays a role in this, and it's not a small role. It's not an irrelevant role. It's a foundational role, and so that's brilliant to see going on over the course of, well, it's been decades, to the point where people have these conversations now, and you can talk about these things and feel like you have meaningful dialogue.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. You kind of touched on the stigma aspect of it. And that's something that, you know, I definitely agree with. I think in the UAP sphere, which is similar in some respects, culturally, I think it's perceived similarly. I think that's also happening, where it's starting to, you know, the real research is starting to step out from behind the curtain and make itself known. And it's gaining credibility, right? And definitely with consciousness research, it seems like it's the same way. That was why I'd asked about the evolution of it. So.
Yeah. But I think, you know, it's just going to get better as people start to recognize that there's some subjective things that are going on that are just as important, if not more important, than the objective things. And we have to incorporate these together to really get a full picture. So.
Well, so let me dig into the International Consciousness Research Laboratory. You are the chairman of the board, and from what I can understand, ICRL is the heir to the work done at PEAR, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Lab. So can you tell me a little bit more about what ICRL is, and then what PEAR was, and how these two connect?
Sure, yeah. So as you described, it's sort of the next stage of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research body of work. And it was founded in the late 90s with the intent of carrying that work on in whatever form it's going to look like. And it's a little bit different than PAIR was. It's probably easier to describe it chronologically. PAIR had a very specific purpose, and that was to explore the effects that consciousness can have on physical systems. And essentially, what is the role of this? It also, and that's what it's best known for, it also studied other aspects of consciousness, such as remote perception and things like that. But the main thing that really made PAIR stand out was that it was doing it as a scientific or engineering study, which is to say they didn't go out and try to find particularly gifted people to run experiments. And in fact, to the contrary, they avoided people who were sort of self-proclaimed psychics or gifted in any way. The whole point was to have lots and lots of quote unquote ordinary people who would run into these experiments. And what they did is they accumulated massive amounts of data. And instead of looking for sort of that one unique event or something that was really spectacular, they said, what's going on in the big data sense of this? And what they did is they established a database of experiments that was huge in comparison to really anything else, much larger than most traditional mainstream research programs, and demonstrated to odds that were far beyond the criteria of any mainstream research program that in fact there were effects here. That if you had some system that a person had an intention towards to change its behavior, that behavior can change. It's not huge. It's not like you're taking a coin flip that's supposed to be 50-50 and turning it into 25-75. Small, right? It's 49.99, 50.01, right? They're small changes, but those small changes are meaningful in two really important ways. One of which is it was repeated over the course of decades, right? And second, the effect size like that, while it's probably not going to do you any good going down to Atlantic City or Las Vegas or something like that, if you're talking about sensitive electronic equipment, that can make a huge difference. And in fact, it's why the whole program got started in the first place, was because people, for example, in the aerospace industry knew that this was a problem. They knew there were these gremlins in the machine and nobody could explain what it was. And that was why PAIR got funded in the first place, to try to come up with some answers to that. So what ICRL is in the context of that was, all right, PAIR did their thing for about 30 years, and they established an incredible foundation that was really at that point beyond just anybody who was still arguing it was because they were just sort of, they didn't want to look. They didn't want to pay attention to the data. They're just like, no, it can't be, it can't be, it can't be. Okay, fine. When we move into ICRL, now we go into that next stage and we start asking questions like, is the academic journals the only place where this stuff should be shared, right? What other kinds of things can we do with it? We've established the legitimacy of the phenomenon. And now there's a couple of questions. One, there's definitely a continuation in research, right? The phenomenon is there, but can we understand in detail the kinds of things that are happening with it so that we can use it for productive, either its technology or other benefits to societal situations, right? Can we get that word out to people beyond sort of traditional mainstream science and let people know what's going on and give them an opportunity to learn more and so forth, right? And then also in beyond the research, can we start to develop tools that use this for some particular purpose? And those tools could be, as I mentioned, technological, right? And people tend to go to the light switch. Can I turn a light on with this? And yes and no. But at this point, we ask ourselves, is that necessarily the best form of how this can affect society and how it can help with human evolution? And chances are the answer is probably no. There's probably better ways of doing this. And so that's really where ICRL fits into this picture, is sort of that next stage. And, we'll probably talk it a little bit later today, just guessing at where the course of the questions are in terms of the kinds of things ICRL is doing to try to make that happen. But that's kind of the probably not terribly quick answer, but sort of sort of quick answer.
No, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Let's get into that now. What are some of the key experiments that ICRL is involved with right now? And of those, which are the most exciting to you? And which do you think may be potentially the most successful over time?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah.
So you're asking, which of your children do you like the best? I'm like, oh, I like them all. So let me give you a couple of different examples of things that we're doing. And since you said experiments, I'm going to talk primarily about research kinds of things, but there's a lot of other things too. And I'll maybe, if you don't cut me off, I'll mention those sort of later. A couple of the research things specifically that have been going on. We got started up with a really fascinating study of bees, actually. And sort of that, if you think about the hive culture, nature of bees, right? This group consciousness kind of effect, it was a natural question to see if we could study whether or not we can detect moments of significance in a hive consciousness. And so we had an experiment that was set up to study bees using random event generators. And the bees decided, you know what, we don't want anything to do with this right now. And so the whole point was to collect data while they swarmed. And then we set the whole thing up and they just didn't swarm. They're like, nope, I'm not doing it this year. So we're going to do that again. But the group that was doing that then started branching out into some other things that have been really exciting. One of which was to take these same REG-based devices and put them into ICUs and hospice settings and take measurements in sort of the moment of death, right, in that transition phase. And we've had a limited amount of data. We've had about, I think it's 8 cases. It might have been 7, it might have been 9, somewhere around 8 cases, and had incredible results with very high signal spikes at the moment of death, and a couple of other key moments before and after, such as when the family discovered something was happening, right, which in some cases was before, in some cases afterwards, and so forth. And in fact, that has led to a project we're doing now where we're actually going to get REGs put into ambulances in Spain so that we can get much larger data collections. And then also a hospice situation, which gives us, that data was collected in an intensive care unit, but the hospice situation gives us a lot more sort of a richer data set to.
Well, if it's okay, let me jump in and ask, could you describe what an REG is? Is that the random number generator? That sounds like something else.
No, it's same thing.
Okay.
So sometimes you hear them called RNGs, or random number generators. In pair, it tended to be called a random event generator because the things that were being detected were really random noise source kinds of things. And it was the quantification of that noise into a 1 or a 0 that essentially turned it into a number. So it was a little more pure to call it a random event generator, but pretty much the same thing. The technology that we were using for the study I just mentioned is actually very interesting in and of itself. It was the brainchild of a fellow in Austria named Wolfhart Janu, who took 2 random event generators and looked at the data in parallel between them. So not only could you look at correlations within one data stream, right, and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm getting more 1s than 0s, or vice versa, or such. You could look at correlations between the 2 machines. So even if each one was generating roughly the same number of 1s versus 0s, are they generating the 1s at the same time as the other one is generating 1s, which should not happen, right? And that turned out to have a tremendous capability for detecting signals. But the other thing I was going to mention as an example is we're actually in preparation right now for looking at we'll be taking measurements during, hopefully, out-of-body experiences. There's a group in Portugal named the International Academy of Consciousness, who's done a lot of work over many, many years with training people to have out-of-body experiences. So we're going to have a team of people who basically, all but one, who have not had out-of-body experiences, go and learn a little bit about this, try to have one, and be monitoring that at that time with these REGs and a few other pieces of equipment as well. So that's another one that's happening right now.
Well, I'm sure that I'm not the first person to ask this, but the random number generator design goes back way back when, right? And I mean, certainly it's proved successful. And I know with the GCP2 network, that's something that is being updated and overhauled. But have you guys looked at different approaches to quantum events? Because I think at its core, if I understand this correctly, really what it's measuring is disturbances in quantum events, right? Quantum effects. And there are several different types of detectors that could be tested. Have you guys looked at testing different types?
There have been just a whole slew of different things that have been tested, and in fact, not just quantum things, but anything that has an inherent element of uncertainty to it, which is this randomness factor, you will see effects. So, for example, one of the earliest experiments at Pear involved a what they call a random mechanical cascade. So imagine a device that's got a whole series of pins, and then you drop a set of balls down from the top. In this particular case, it was about 9,000 balls that would drop down and run. They would bounce around through the pins, and when they got to the bottom, they would go in different bins. And statistically, what you would expect, and in general, what would happen is you'd have a Gaussian distribution. Most of the balls go in the middle, and then they tailor off around the ends. But what they discovered was that when you had an intention on this, you could get more balls, for example, to fall to the left or fall to the right, or other kinds of adjustments to the statistics, right? It didn't just have to be left or right. It could be, I want a larger standard deviation, or I want things to tend to be more towards the middle than they otherwise normally should be. So even these kinds of things, which are macroscopic effects, the same thing was there, as long as there was that room for uncertainty. And a lot of the really profound lessons that were learned out of this is the importance of uncertainty in this. For example, one of the things that was very important when Pear did its work is they would bring people in, they'd talk a little bit about it, and they'd encourage people to have fun, for one thing. They'd leave it very open-minded, and they had these wonderful results. Other folks who would try to replicate this, and people would go and they would see how they were doing it, and they wouldn't replicate it. And you'd, what's going on? And they would go into these other places, and they would find that what would happen is people would sit the operators down and go, well, some people claim that you can have an effect, right? So we want you to give it a try. Well, they kind of killed the whole idea right from the very beginning, because they've established in that person's mind there's no room for possibility at that point.
Well, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm still stuck on the metal balls thing. I'm just visualizing in my head someone's looking at you saying, okay, now I want you to focus, and I'm going to release 9,000 metal balls that are going to click clack all the way down. So
yeah. That is what it is. And if you want, I can try to find a picture in a few minutes. I'll
oh, no worries at all.
It's a glorious machine. The machine itself, as a quick aside, is called Murphy. And the reason it was called Murphy is because when it was being built, it took a very long time. And the reason it took a long time is because it was basically the embodiment of Murphy's Law. Yeah. Anything that could possibly go wrong did. And we now have that equipment got moved over to Northern England, where we're in the process of setting it up right now. And we are finding exactly the same thing going on as we try to reconstruct it from the original materials. Everything that could possibly go wrong goes wrong. But
well,
it's
exciting. I mean, even nuclear decay is governed by quantum uncertainty, right? So potentially you might even be able to test that. I know I'm going way up my questions list.
No. That's thank you, because I got kind of sidetracked there. The answer to your question, though, is there were lots of different things. Original equipment that was used. There was a thermistor experiment that was looking at this from a heat-based perspective. There were interference-based experiments that were run. There were ones that used that fluid mechanics, that used sound, pretty much anything. The advantage that the REGs had was lots of data that you could collect very quickly. So that was a very effective way of doing it. And the fact that you could move them around, which in the early days, the whole point was to be next to the machine. One of the really amazing things they eventually realized was it really didn't matter where you were. Distance doesn't have anything to do with this. But up until that point, it's one thing to move around a small REG. It's another thing to move around a huge thing mounted to the wall, dropping 9,000 balls. So the REGs had a lot of advantages there.
Yeah, and I guess that probably the metal balls probably wouldn't work well in a hospice setting either. That would get you kicked
Probably
out pretty
not.
quick. So
Yeah, it's noisy.
yeah, well, so I want to address. I used Wikipedia for some of this, and they cited critics who suggested that Pear back in the day lacked scientific rigor, used poor methodology, and misused statistics, which is interesting because these same unnamed critics have said that about pretty much everything, including
Yeah.
NASA lately, right? So I mean, that could mean anything,
Yep.
but what I wanted to ask though was how would you respond to the past criticisms, and do you think that those critics actually helped consciousness research move forward by improving scientific methodologies since Pear's ended?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. A lot sort of boiled up in that. One, and you kind of hinted at this already. Remember, or keep in mind that Wikipedia is not a scientific thing, and to be
Yes.
honest, even science these days is not exactly a scientific thing. It can be a very biased source of information. If you look at it, Wikipedia has its own political agenda, so it's great if you want to find out what the population of Boston is, but if you're looking for something that has some level of political charge or underlying message or anything like that, it's always a danger. But the question that you asked, right, is very true. Hair got a lot of this. It got a lot in the very early days, was very severe. And what first of all, the Hair had a distinct advantage in that it was being run by Robert John, who is unquestionably a top researcher who understood what it meant to put rigorous scientific protocols in place. And so they started off on a very good foot because they really did have some of the best science, the best methodologies, and they were their own harshest critics for this. So people would come to the lab and they would talk them through it, and then people would go away kind of going, okay, and that was it. And then more people would come by and they would have conversations about it. And eventually what happened is everybody who came by and had a conversation about it with people at the lab stopped saying that. And then the only people who kept saying that were the people who didn't want to go to the lab and didn't want to hear anything more.
Yeah.
And that never really stopped, I think, during the life of the lab. There was always somebody who wanted to say that, but people who looked into the methodologies realized they spent an enormous amount of time doing that. I think, however, your point, Tim, about this improving methodologies in the field writ large is a very accurate one, because it is very charged. And there are deep implications for the nature of humanity, the nature of science, the nature of our understanding of the world, and people are very invested in the status quo. And when I say invested, I mean that in every sense, right? They're personally invested. Somebody who went and did their traditional science background, my background's in nuclear physics. I know how much effort it took to get a PhD in nuclear physics. It's not trivial, right? So you've invested a tremendous amount of time, and people didn't want to feel like that was misguided in some way. Personally, I don't think it is. I don't, and because nobody said that the models that we have are outright garbage. That was never a statement, simply that they're incomplete, right? And that there's a lot more to be examined here. But aside from the personal investment, there's literally financial investment in this, right? If you feel that you're not going to be able to get the research grants and bring home the money to feed your children as well, if this sort of thing happens, you'll get people saying some crazy things like, and this is a quote of a Nobel-winning physicist, "I wouldn't believe this even if it were true," which is like the absolute antithesis of the scientific mindset, right? Like, whoa, okay. We've gone past science here. We're talking about something that's very personal to somebody at that point. But I do think it's,
and conscious research, I think part of it is this in a sense, this is personal to all of us, right? Because one of the areas that you guys are delving into is, I mean, human beings, all of us have had experiences that we can't explain, right? And I have a deep background in psychology, and so I know what all the standard excuses are, and most of the time those fit, but there are times when they don't. And I think when you look back over human history, right? I mean, I would venture to guess that probably most of the major religions, many major philosophies, you know, things along this line incorporate elements of the very things that you guys are researching. And so you know, I applaud this, but I also understand, as they've said, science moves forward one funeral at a time, and it can be difficult for people who
Right.
are established to accept. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. Well, if it's okay, let me ask about the Global Consciousness Project directly, because I've been doing interviews about that all week. And that for me,
okay.
I'm really excited about that because that's like a big data project, right? And so I know that there is a connection there. ICRL is connected with GCP, but
Mhm.
from what I understand, that's a separate entity, right? Can you tell
It
me how
is.
these two are connected and kind of what your thoughts are on it?
Sure. So the connection is that Roger Nelson, who is part of the Pear Lab from essentially right from the beginning, he was, I think, if he wasn't the first person hired in the lab, he was within the first one or two. He really, from very early on, was part of the Pear Lab. And when in the 90s, as they were starting to talk about, you know, the lab's going to be shutting down at some point, I think that was when Roger started to run this. He may have been earlier in the 90s. I don't actually know the GCP timeline specifically, but he had this idea using the same kinds of technology that Pear was using to say, wait, you know, maybe there's some other things that we can be studying here on different scales. And so he had taken that idea and turned it into the Global Consciousness Project, where, and I won't try to describe the whole thing except to say that there's an entire network of random event generators that are globally distributed, collecting data, and then people are able to look at that data and see correlations with major events that are either regionally or globally significant, and look at the correlations in the data with that. So Roger's just an incredibly dear friend of the ICRL and me personally. I mean, I grew up with him being sort of, you know, this sort of secondary father figure, if you will. It's his son and me have been the closest of friends for basically our entire lives, right? So we're very, you know, very well acquainted, you could say. And by the way, interestingly enough, he is our ICRL meetup speaker tomorrow.
Okay.
So he's going to be talking about the Global Consciousness Project there. So there's this inherent connection. We're looking at the same thing. We're using very similar tools, and I think that's really the connection there. Just sort of like-minded interest in exploring what the possibilities are and what this can mean for humanity.
Yeah. Well, and one of the reasons, I guess another reason that I touched on that, and we talked briefly about quantum earlier, but I wanted to get into the quantum aspect of this because, again, with my own reading here, my own research, we have doctors Hammeroff and Penrose, Dean Radin, Roger Nelson, Kaufman, Scully, and many others who believe or at least suspect that human consciousness is quantum in nature and appears connected to the world outside of the human biological brain. So would you tend to agree with that?
I do. I don't think I would use the same words, but that's because I kind of view things a little bit differently, and I'm always a little bit cautious when it comes to language, which is one of
Yeah.
my sort of central areas. To recognize that a lot of times you say a term, and especially these very charged terms like quantum,
Yes. Yeah.
and you don't always know that whoever's listening to you really understands it the same way. Me, I'm, you know, background very specifically in physics. When I hear quantum, I'm thinking about things that are quantized, and so right, I have a very specific way of thinking about that. So I don't tend to use that, but I will say that what what I think is the commonality here is that what is the nature of being us and having a consciousness, or in fact even being a consciousness, if you don't mind my phrasing it that way, definitely goes beyond sort of this materialistic, you know, it's this stuff alone. And I personally tend to look at it a little bit differently, in that rather than saying, well, there's the consciousness or the mind, and then there is the body, it's more a question of, you know, I'm looking at a coin and I want to say, which side am I looking at? There is a thing, right? And they're definitely connected, but if you always look at that coin from one particular angle, you may not recognize that you're only seeing one aspect of that coin, and there's more to it, right? And heaven help you if you're looking at the edge, it looks like a very narrow, insignificant thing, only to find out it's much bigger than you thought it was, right? And I think that's what really happens with this. There's so much evidence now that we are connected in ways that just cannot be tied down to atoms in the traditional way of thinking about it. People who have memories of things they can't have memories of in traditional ways, people who have experiences like you were mentioning that just can't be explained, right? I mean, as a pure science, if you have that feeling that somebody's staring at you, right, which is something that most people have had, to turn around, find out that somebody's staring at them. Physics, it doesn't work that way. We don't have beam lasers pointing out of our eyes and putting pressure on somebody's back, right? It doesn't work that way. And yet we do have those experiences, and some of them obviously considerably more surprising than even that, right? The child who has vivid memories of being a World War II fighter pilot, to the point that he can recall names of crewmates and things like, that can't happen. How can that be? Right. There's so much more now. And this is what, going back to the very beginning, what's kind of exciting about this is people are realizing you can't continue to ignore this stuff forever. You may not feel comfortable with it, but you have to recognize that we're more than this, right?
Well, and actually that takes me to my next question, which is I have done over the last year, I've done many interviews on UAP, right, the UAP phenomena, and there are a couple of giant parallels there. One of them is that despite government acknowledgement of the phenomena, right? I mean, the government is now saying UAP are real, and then the next thing the media said was, they're not extraterrestrial, right? And I've seen statements from the government saying, well, we're not saying they're not. We're not saying what they are, but we're not saying what they're not, right? Right. So, but one of the things that interests me is it seems like a key social challenge here is emotional acceptance of the phenomena, right? There's intellectual acceptance, and I would put myself in this boat, right? There's a difference between knowing something is real, something is there, and saying, okay, there's proof, there's admission of this or that, and then getting it on a gut level. And it seems like a lot of this material in consciousness research is in the same place, where you can provide proof, you can provide evidence, data, statistics, but it's difficult for people, especially in the sciences, to get that on a gut level. So, one of the things that I wanted to ask about was, you'd mentioned this before. How can we learn to be comfortable that our experiences beyond materialism are real, valid, and useful?
Yeah. There's that organization that I mentioned where we put all the equipment it's called the WYRD experience, WYRD, where WYRD is the sort of ancient Anglo-Saxon principle of interconnectedness. So it plays on a lot of levels. Last year, last November, we have science and consciousness workshops every year in November. Last year's conference was on the phrase making weird the norm. And this is really what you're talking about here. How do we get to a point where people can start to recognize this is normal? Most people have these kinds of experiences, have reason to feel at a gut level, I felt that. I did feel something that I can't explain in the traditional kinds of ways, and continuing to make people feel comfortable with the idea of talking about it. For ICRL, at least I should say, feel that the best way that we can go about doing that is to reach out to as young an audience as absolutely possible, so that people don't have to overcome this hesitance because they've already learned that they shouldn't talk about that. They shouldn't believe that, even if they've had experiences. They shouldn't, no, that's not it, right? You got to stop it before it gets there, because the amount of work that it takes to unlearn something is far, far greater than it takes to learn something. And I can tell you, I used to be a professor, and trying to unteach a student something that they got wrong is very, very difficult in comparison to just teaching them something that is, and this is not like talking about consciousness. This is talking about teaching physics, right? Everything is very difficult to get something out of your head once you've got it there. So starting at a very early age is really the right way of doing this, and introducing it in a way that doesn't make it scary or otherwise imposing, right? We tend to want to sound as intelligent as we can, so we're going to make it sound very serious. Oh, this is very complex, like it's not complex. It's exactly what you think. Kids are much better at this than adults. It's not complex. Yeah. It's natural. And getting people to recognize it's natural and to accept the fact that it's reasonable to feel that way. For us, in fact, one of the things ICRL has done in trying to share the research and everything that went on with PAIR is publishing. So we've got we've now just recently published our 20th book, and the 20th book is sort of a diversion from the traditional books that we've had. Those traditional books, the first 19, were basically nonfiction. They were, they would report on statistics, or they would talk about these various effects in kind of scientific ways. The 20th book is called Nexus, and it's a novel. It's not about, like, here's some charts, go read them. It's a story, but it weaves in all these ideas, right? It's fiction, right? It's an entertaining story. It's fiction, but as fiction, it gives you the opportunity to enjoy and open your mind to ideas. In this particular case, one of the central pieces of this is an idea of syntropy, which is about sort of the complement to entropy, where entropy really describes a causal-based universe. We do things because of what happened in the past. Syntropy is more of a purpose-based thing. We do things because of the purpose towards which they lead, right? And the balance between these. It introduces this idea, not with charts, not with tables of numbers, just the idea, right? And to help get that out there so people can start just playing with the idea. Does it feel right to you? And I think that's the way we're going to go about this, is to introduce this in non-threatening ways, to introduce it as young as possible into people. That's the hope.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah. So on that note, Jeffrey, let me thank you so much for your time today. And let me close by asking, what comes next for you, and what comes next for ICRL? What do you see in the next, let's say, the remainder of 2023 into 2024?
So I think for us, we want to continue to reach broader and broader audiences, to be able to share the things that we've discovered in interesting and fun ways. Over the last many years, we've held meetups that originally were in person, and then eventually with COVID went online, to share things, and kind of like somebody will give a talk and an audience will listen, and then they'll ask some questions. But we want to continue to make that as engaging as possible. We're looking into identifying a physical space where people can come and take classes and learn about this from all kinds of dimensions, from the scientist who wants to know, how can I use the most effective protocols to run an experiment of my own, to people who say, I want to know what this means for me in terms of my personal growth. And to be able to run those kinds of classes both in person, and it's still remote. I mean, we're living in a global situation, right? I don't think that's going to go away. But to be able to do more and more of that, obviously to continue the experiments that we talked about, and to develop new ways of sort of getting those ideas and those capabilities into as many hands as possible, so people can play with it, developing new tools, apps for your phone, devices that you can hold, devices that you don't need to hold, so forth. So that's really, those are kinds of, to be brief about it. Next time we'll use all 30 minutes to answer that question.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Again, Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time today, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on the interview.